Let's go back to the calling code. In the onPostAsync method, there's some tricky code here. Instead of just taking the expense object that was filled in from the page, the one we saw at the top of the file, the code is creating an empty expense and then filling it using this try_update_model_async method. Then the user ID is being given a value, and I know that's because the team hasn't implemented authentication yet, so this is just a temporary value. But I have a suspicion the problem has to do with this method. Let's figure out what this code actually does. Let's copy this method name and go to the browser. And let's search for ASP.NET Razor and the method name. That brings us to the Microsoft documentation. Let's take a look. This can be a little intimidating. There's all these overloads, so how do you know which one we're using? Let's go back to the code. If I highlight the opening bracket and type it in again, I get IntelliSense that shows me that we're on the 4th of 7 method overloads. And this one we're using has 3 input parameters. The first parameter is highlighted here, and if I hit the comma, it thinks we've moved on to the second, and then another comma is the last one. So this overload expects a model, a string, and an array of expressions. First, let's remove these commas, and then let's go back and see if there's a similar overload in the docs. This looks like the one here. It's got the model as the first input, then a string, then an array of expressions. If I click it, it explains each of these parameters better. The model instance to update. Okay, that's the expense that's being created. The name is the name to use when looking up values, and that was expense in the code, which is the name of the property that's being filled in by ASP.NET from the page. So that makes sense. And then the third parameter is the top-level properties, which need to be included for the current model. Let's go to the code. So these properties need to be filled. If I hover over the expense class, which we're creating an instance of, and right-click, I'll choose Go to Definition. So there are the properties for the expense class. This is the class that's being used by the Entity Framework to generate the database too. So there's an ID, a description, a date incurred, location, price, and an integer called expense type ID. The comment above says this is a foreign key. Then there's the expense type object. So depending on the type of query that you write to get the expense from the database, Entity Framework can use the foreign key to also populate the related expense type object, so you can use it in code. I know that kind of requires some knowledge of Entity Framework, but just to let you know. Let's go back to the Create page. It looks like we're missing the expense type ID in this list of properties. So when the new empty expense object is getting created, it's missing the expense type ID from the page. It makes sense, that's why the value is never reaching the database. So let's set a breakpoint here, and I'll continue running the code. That causes the error again, so let's back up and try to create the new expense. Now we're paused inside the code behind for the page. I'll advance the cursor using F10. So the empty expense is created, and when we get to this point, the expense coming from the browser is being used to populate this empty expense object. You can see the values up here. And once that's done, we can inspect the empty expense object. So the expense type ID is empty. We've narrowed down the error to the try_update_model_async line of code. Okay, well, we know this is going to blow up, so I'll stop the application. And let's add an expression here to populate the expense type ID value. Okay, we've included that missing parameter, so let's try running the code now. When it opens up, I'll go to Expenses and create a new expense. And I'll just skip ahead to where the values are populated. I'm using the same values again, so I can try to recreate the exact same problem. When I click Create, it goes to the code behind that handles the Submit button. And let's step through again using F10. When we get to the line of code that calls the database code, I'll hover over it to check the data. And the expense type ID is now populated. F10 steps us into the expense repository code because we still have that breakpoint set. But I'm just going to click the Continue button in Visual Studio. And it looks like the data has been saved because we've been redirected to the list of expenses. This new expense is coming from the database, so we know the data is saved properly. We've successfully fixed the error. Of course, we'd want to do some more testing to make sure there aren't other errors with different data values. But our goal here was to debug this particular error.